Hello, NASCAR fantasy racers. Welcome to Dan Beaver's fantasy racing pit stop this week for the Richmond race, the penultimate race. I guess you'd call it penultimate race of the chase to the or a race to the chase for the championship. I don't know if that's going to affect the way Dan suggests you predict for this or pick for this race. We'll get into that as the next 30 minutes or so unravel. I'm Charlie Turner, and I'm joined by the guy you really want to listen to today. That's Dan Beaver. Hey, Dan, how are you?
I'm doing great. And last week was the penultimate regular season race. Next to last. This is the last regular season race.
There you go. See, that's why you're the editor.
Yeah. Yeah, words are my words are my bitch.
That's fine. Somebody's got to do it.
Yeah.
All right. So for the the last race to the chase race, we're going to the nice little 3/4 mile kind of flat track, kind of wide. One of my favorite racetracks, D-shaped, oval, I guess, kind of at Richmond International Raceway. Under the lights, always a good-looking race. Lots on the line. Lots of drivers that need to win. Some drivers that need to not wreck. Some drivers that probably just only want to do is win or wreck. How's that going to affect us? I mean, is that pretty concise? That's kind of what it's all about this week, I think.
It is. And the fact that everybody knows that often has kind of a reverse effect. Chances are that since everybody's expecting it to be this wild race where everybody's going for broke and wrecking someone if they have to get a position, it could end up being just a calm race. Everybody could sit back and wait for that next driver to make the mistake or someone to trigger something at the front of the pack. And I wouldn't be surprised if we don't settle into some long green flag segments. But when you get down to the end and no one can be patient any longer, it probably will end up being a bit of a wild affair. A lot like last week at Atlanta. I mean, that had long sessions where really nothing much was happening except for Kevin Harvick running away from the field. Then you get down to the green-white check. You get Kane with making that great restart, and you get down to the 2 green-white checkered finishes after that, and the race suddenly is an exciting race because of the ending. I think Richmond, my prediction is, will be exactly the same thing.
Yeah, I would expect the last 50 laps, 60 laps or so to be pretty intense, probably several restarts, and whoever's good at the restarts and gets the tire strategy right is probably going to come out, with a better finish, maybe not the winner, but it'll be interesting. I'm looking forward to it, probably as much as any races I have this year, really. I always kind of look forward to this race at Richmond.
Yeah, and we mentioned this earlier in the on pit row segment, I believe, that NASCAR kind of lucked into having the perfect racetrack for the final regular season race. They didn't rearrange the schedule, so you can't really say that they put it there on purpose. But you've got a track that acts like a flat track, acts like a short track, and acts like an unrestricted intermediate speedway sometimes with that long sweeping front stretch. The speeds are really good, and getting that momentum, keeping that momentum down that stretch is a lot like Michigan and Auto Club, only to scale. So no matter what your strengths are, you've got something that you can pull from your bank, your memory bank, your setup bank, and have a shot at winning here, or have a shot at running strong here. Only one guy's going to win, and predicting winners has got to be really, really difficult. But we've got some 20 drivers who could get a chase berth, one way or the other. So all of those drivers are going to feel somewhat confident coming into Richmond because of something that's happened in the last 25 races on one of those other track types.
Okay, so you've got a list of maybe 20 drivers that you think can contend. If you're playing in a salary cap game, where are you going to start this week? You're going to you're going to pick somebody you like that's cheap first, or are you going to try and get your best drivers up top first?
This week, I would treat Richmond like I would treat Talladega and Daytona every time it comes up on the schedule. It is going to be a wild card race. It's not going to look that way for the longest time. If you replay this halfway through the race, you're going to say, okay, boy, that prediction failed. But at the end, you just don't know. You're not going to know what's going to happen. So don't spend a lot of money on any driver that's going to be a more predictable good value later on. That said, there are drivers like Jimmy Johnson who became unpredictable for a period of time during the summer. And now that he kind of a little bit the team painted themselves into a corner. They couldn't continue to have the bad results that they had. So they kind of went back to basics 3 weeks ago after they left Watkins Glen, and I think they'll keep that up. So Johnson's not usually a good value here. He not often a good value here because neither of Richmond's races are in the chase, so the team kind of throws them away. But I don't think he can afford to do that now. So here, I think you don't start at the top, you don't start at the bottom. You just look for drivers that you think are going to be good values across the board. And Jimmy Johnson, we know he can win any place. We know he can run well any place. You start to think about what those external factors are, and you decide whether or not he's good. Then you look at a Denny Hamlin. We know he's great on short flat tracks. We know he's great on long flat tracks. But he didn't have much momentum for the longest time this season as well. They turned things around a couple of months back. So now he comes into a track that's his fourth best in terms of career average finishes, and with a little momentum on his side. This is the kind of track that Denny Hamlin, kind of track and race that Denny Hamlin could dominate for a time. Now, the finish, don't know. I don't know what will happen in those last 10, 15 laps. So you wouldn't want to drop. You don't want to make room for any one driver. You kind of want a balanced approach this week, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I would think also on the Denny Hamlin angle, there are going to be some players out there that'll probably just write Hamlin off from picking this week because this is the last week that he's without his crew chief and car chief again. Even though he's had good results the last 2-3 races, I can still see people say, no, I'm not picking him. He doesn't have, the guys that got him all that success there. I think maybe that makes him a bit of a contrarian pick, sort of.
Well, they may want to think about this might be the time where they stumbled into something that's working because they have 6 top 10 finishes in their last 7 oval track races. Most of that's been without Darian Grubb. Right. And they were leading when they got wrecked at Bristol. So that should be 7 top 10 finishes in the last 10 races. They didn't lose anything. In this age of communication, they also didn't lose Darian Grubb. I mean, he's there by Skype or whatever it is, a cell phone. The only thing you can't do is physically touch the car when it's at the track. But he's still there. He's still their crew chief. He's still calling the race, except in those emergency situations. He's still part of the team. So I don't know that if you wanted to write him off, you would have written Hamlin off because of all the bad things that happened between like Darlington and Kentucky. Only had a handful of top 5s, no other top 10s. He did get his victory in there, but it was at Talladega, and that's unpredictable. So that's why you would be more likely to write him off, not because of the loss of the crew chief. And that said, I think he's got his momentum at the perfect time. With Richmond coming up now, we've got New Hampshire right around the corner. So we've got a couple of strong short flat tracks. And am I boring you? I think I just saw you yawn, didn't I?
No, I was coughing, but I actually muted it. I was smart enough to hit the cough button, so you thought I was yawning because you couldn't hear me hack.
Okay, well, I'm glad to know that I'm not boring.
That's broadcast etiquette I was displaying there.
Yeah, and I realize I'm a little low energy this week, so that's the first thing.
I'm wrapped. I'm wrapped. Believe me, because these hangouts we do every week, I learn something every week that we talk about this stuff. Because I think I follow it pretty closely. I don't follow the stats the way you fantasy guys do because I don't play it all the time, and the stats aren't all that important to me. But I have I have kind of the seat of the pants feel, I think.
And I think that's one of the best things about fantasy NASCAR. Honestly, I didn't play a lot before I started writing about it. And then an opportunity came up 10, 11, 12 years ago whatever it was. And when I had to first start writing about fantasy, I had to start paying attention to everything and everyone in the field. If you're not playing, if someone stumbles across these podcasts and they're not playing, then you should be, because it gives you a different appreciation for what's actually happening. You have to think in terms of who's strong, who's run strong versus who's finished well, and that's not always the same thing. And you've got to have an opinion about all 43 drivers for the most part. So I think it makes you a more well-rounded fan to play the fantasy games.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I have to guard against is and I know what my colleagues on pit row, Steve and Beth, are the kind of same way. You have to, when you're playing in a fantasy league and you're actually, rather than just trying to pick who you think is going to win, there's a different mindset there. You're looking for, if that guy that's down in a salary cap game is a cheap driver, you're not looking for the guy down there who's likely to win it. You're looking for the guy down there who's likely to finish 25th, maybe, or something like that, and get you positive points based on the value of the money you spent for.
Plus, if you're playing, I think the best salary cap games also have a little more complicated scoring procedures, like NASCAR.com's Fantasy Live, where it's also giving you points for who's got the fastest laps and what have you, place differential, so that you have to think about whether or not this driver improves in a race. So I think the more compelling games are ones that are doing something other than just rewarding you for who happens to finish in the top 10.
Yeah.
Most of the time, who happens to finish in the top 10 was one of the 10 best drivers, but not always. And you get into situations where you have to think more fully. You have to think outside of the box.
So who else do you like? You mentioned Denny Hamlin, you mentioned Jimmy Johnson. Who else do you like this week?
Well, we talked about
still thinking from the salary cap standpoint, and maybe bringing in some of those other factors.
We talked about this briefly before we went on air, and I said it half sarcastically and half not. This week, the Joe Falk team, normally the number 33, is going to do a special tribute for Junie Donlevy. They're going to renumber the car 90 for this week only, since they're at what was his home track. And things like that are sometimes that little bit of intangible that makes the driver run just a little bit better. David Stremme is going to be cheap. The number 33 is a much better value when they've got one of the RCR drivers in it, but they still get support from Richard Childress in the weeks that Ty Dillon, Brian Scott are not in the car. So I suspect that David Stremme could be one of those bargain basement drivers that could do much better than anticipated, certainly beat his average overall. You've got Justin Allgaier, who's come on strong on short tracks, like he should. Rookies should run best on driver's tracks, short tracks where they've got the most experience. And Allgaier's been doing well there. So he's going to be another good, cheap salary cap play. He's got, in 4 short track races, his worst was a 23rd at Martinsville. His best was a 17th in Bristol Spring Race. So he's in that narrow band where you can almost be certain that he's going to finish somewhere right around 20th. Especially then if he qualifies outside of the top 20 in a game like NASCAR.com's Fantasy Live, then he's going to be a great value because he's going to get place differential points. And consistency is often just as important or almost as important as raw strength. So Allgaier, I think, makes a good fantasy play, especially for his price. At the top of the list, you got Joey Logano that won at Richmond, won at Bristol, finished top 5 at Martinsville in his last 3 races. So he's got that momentum, and he's got a ton of great finishes. Would have had, I think, 7 top 6 finishes, if not for last week's accident at Atlanta when he poked his nose to the outside of Kevin Harvick and got it bruised. So I think those are a lot of your best cap plays.
Okay, well, let's talk about the salary cap game. Let's move on to the Yahoo Sports game. But before we do that, I want to remind everybody who's watching, whether it's live or later or down the road, that Dan, of course, is one of the lead fantasy sports writers for YahooSports.com, and you can read Dan's NASCAR Yahoo game recap every week. It's really not a recap; it's like a book How many pages this week? 13, 14, 15 pages?
20
20.
something, 21, 22,
Oh, wow. 20 pages of
22.
intense fantasy sports advice specifically for Richmond and for this race. So if you're playing, you need to bookmark that place and download that every week and study it, make your picks. And if you're just wanting to have something else, as Dan said earlier, if you want to have something to help you enjoy the race when you're watching it Saturday night, if you're kind of a novice to this, or you just want to have another outlook on things, download that PDF and look through it and see that he isn't really he is just as smart as we say every week. And then Dan also writes some fantasy NASCAR content for rotoworld.com. So get over there and check both those out. That's unique to him, and it's the best fantasy advice you can get anywhere online. So, okay, enough of your commercial. Now let's talk about the Yahoo game.
Yeah, and actually the more interesting thing is figuring out exactly how badly I was wrong sometimes. So that happens too.
Find out where the Beaver curse came into play.
Yeah, and you definitely don't want to start all the drivers that I start. There is something called the Beaver Jinx, the Beav Jinx that's out there. But where Yahoo's concerned, you've got that extra caveat that you can only start a driver 9 times. So it's not just finding the driver who's perfect this week. It's the driver who is good this week, and this is likely to be one of his 9 best races. In Group A, not so much of an issue. You've got a bunch of great drivers up there. It tends to be kind of evenly distributed among the top 4 or 5 racers in Group A. So except when Jimmy Johnson's on a tear or Kevin Harvick was on a tear for a little bit, you're not getting to a point where you're probably exhausting your allocations on given drivers. So in Group A, you can think in terms of who's strong this week, and make your picks that way, because it's almost always a little bit different. So in Group A this week, I think Dale Earnhardt Jr. is probably one of my top picks. He is one of my top picks. He's doing much better on all tracks this year than he's done in the past couple of seasons. This is a career-like season for him. And even when he gambles, this is a team that gambles wisely. They take chances, but they know when to kind of back away from that chances, and they usually don't finish in the 20s because they run out of gas or they blow a tire and hit the wall. I think they're a lot smarter about how they take their chances.
Or speed on pit row, which used to be one of Junior's bugaboos, and they seem to have eliminated that this year.
Or missing his pit box. Yeah, there was a time there where he just absolutely could not pit. So I think the crew chief has something to do with that too. The coach has something to do with that, getting him in and out the right way now. In Group A, I think I've got Harvick ranked 2nd. I'm not exactly sure why I did it. I mean,
this track is kind of similar to Phoenix, and he's always been real good at Phoenix. So I mean, is that part of it? I would think that would kind of carry to here.
That is part of it, but it's more his recent momentum than it is his record at Richmond in the last couple of years. But he runs so strong every week that you just know he's capable of rattling off a strong finish. Let me pull this up real quick. I can get enough of his name in there so my dad was to find him. He's got 2 victories going back to 2011 here at Phoenix, so he obviously can run well. But in the last 6 races, those are 2 of only 3 top 10s. And the others have been close enough. 11 last 2 races here, that he shows a balance of consistency and strength, and I think that's why I've got him ranked number 2. But if he misses the top 5, he's more likely to finish just outside the top 10, and that can be a little frightening for a Group A driver. Last week, I think, is a good example of you can't count your chickens until they hatch, and his egg broke on the final that next to last restart. So if he's too risky, if you're not sure what you're going to get from him, I would jump down, and Matt Kenseth would probably be my next guy. He also shows a nice balance. of strength and consistency. But his consistency over the last 4 races, his last race with Roush Fenway and 3 races with Joe Gibbs, has been consistently at the front of the pack. All of them have been 7th or better. 2 of them were 5th place finishes. Now that the pressure's off of his shoulders, he's locked into the chase. Last week, I don't think he wanted to take that little bit of extra risk that might have ended up crashing him. This week, I think he might. And in his case, I think he's a good enough driver that if he takes a risk, it's going to be a calculated risk, and he's probably not going to end up in the wall. Not a driver that wrecks a lot. So he's a good driver to roll the dice on, and probably is who I would start this week in my personal game because of all the cap or the allocation management considerations. Jeff Gordon, strictly by the numbers, his last 6 races versus his last 3 years at Richmond, he's should be ranked number 1. He's done really well in this fall race over the past 6 or 7 years, but for me, I'm out of allocations. If you're not out of allocations for him, or I'm almost out of allocations, then you probably would want to give him a start. So I think that gives you enough options in Group A. Go down to Group B, and Carl Edwards is who I've got ranked first there. Richmond is a lot like Michigan and Auto Club to scale. It's a small version of those tracks. So it comes as really no surprise that Edwards is good here as he's good on other tracks, on those bigger unrestricted intermediate speedways. His last 9 Richmond races have resulted in 8 top 10 finishes. Most of those are, actually it's about evenly distributed between top 5s and top 10s. But in his case, even if he misses and finishes in that 6th to 12th place range, still a good value in Group B because you don't expect quite as much from them, and you've got 2 picks down there. You can get a little more creative where that's concerned. And then of course he won this race last year. It didn't, a little bit of a surprise, and that the end of that race probably makes it not entirely predictable, but he is capable of finishing in the top 5. He's capable of winning. He's got a 2nd place finish in fall 2011 as well. So is a good driver to. I think he's a good, consistent driver. And now that some of those concerns about whether or not he was getting the best equipment at Roush Fenway Racing have been answered, he's good. He's a good pick. Denny Hamlin, we talked about earlier. He's down in Group B, and I think he's got the possibility to dominate this race, possibly win, probably get a top 5, almost certainly get a top 10. And if you think in those terms, then that makes him a good value here versus a Joey Logano or Brad Keselowski, who, if they get everything right, could win, can get to the front. Logano has a good pick thing for a top 10, I think, than even a driver like Denny Hamlin, who's got a much better record, even though Logano's got a much better record overall this season, because Hamlin's got the momentum at the right time, and Hamlin's got the this track type is one of his best. So those are the guys that I would put at the very top. I wouldn't overlook Tony Stewart this week. At some point, the media is going to get a hold of him again. At some point, he's going to be distracted. He has been up and down, hit or miss, throughout the season. But Richmond is the kind of track where he's done well in the past. It's the kind of track that suits his driving style. You can be aggressive when you need to be. You can be patient when you need to be. And if you're aggressive and miss a mark, you're probably going to be able to make it up in the next 5 to 10 laps. So Tony Stewart, last week he ran well. This week I think he's going to run well again. I don't think the media is going to be on him the same way that they will after the chase happens. I suspect NASCAR is going to help protect him one more week so that he's got a good opportunity to. He's got as good an opportunity to make the chase as he should have, and then at a certain point, NASCAR will kind of back off and let the media get back to him. So, but I don't think it'll happen this week. So I think that makes him a good value in Group.
And he's got that all or nothing thing hanging there too. If the chase is still one of his goals this year, he has to win. Saturday night. So if he's in
If it is,
position, you could have one of those guys that gets you a lot of points or gets you nothing.
yep. And if it is, I'm not 100% sure it is. I'm not sure he wants to be in the limelight right at the moment.
Yeah, I'm not sold on that. I'm not sold on
Yeah,
that.
he obviously he wants to be there for the sponsors. He wants to be there for the team, but I think he would be just as content to finish this season out with solid top 10 finishes out of the limelight.
Yeah, yeah, I think I think you might be right there. Okay, so we've got C left. Interesting choices, I would think, in C this week.
Well, and Justin Allgaier is the C driver that I think makes a good salary cap pick and makes a good Group C pick too, because he's got all those top 20 finishes. He's probably not going to outpoint both Larson and Dillon. He may outpoint one of them if the other has some trouble, but he's going to finish close enough to them to make him a good allocation management pick. If you've got 9 combined allocations remaining for Larson and Dillon, or even 8, you could run the season out using those 2 drivers. Avoid them at Talladega for the same reason that you'd avoid Jimmy Johnson or one of the marquee drivers at Talladega, just because of the threat of the big one crash. But you could run them out. You run them out.
Thinking Danica Patrick and C at Talladega. I just think you got to mark it down, right? You know, we're weeks ahead of Talladega, but I think you got to take her there.
Yeah, and Danica Patrick is great on those restrictor plate super speedways.
Yeah.
But the point here is that both Larson and Dillon are going to be strong on every track that they go to.
Right.
Dillon's going to be a little bit stronger, I think, on unrestricted intermediate speedways, so I would save him for the similarly configured mile-and-a-half tracks and maybe Homestead. Larson, I think, is going to be stronger on rough surface tracks. Look for him at Dover. Look for him even on the flat track. He just recently got a good start or finish at New Hampshire, and that makes him a good start here too if you've got the allocation. So if your choice is, do I start Dillon, do I start Larson, this week I'd go with Larson. But if your choice is, I've got to save some allocations because I'm going to run out before the end of the year, I would go with Allgaier. And there's really not a whole lot more that needs to be said down in Group C because there isn't anybody else that really is going to challenge. We've got Clay Rogers for the first time this year in a car, but it's not going to be a very well-funded car. You could throw him.
About that 90 car that you mentioned in the.
You could. Strimmy will outperform himself, outperform this team, but he's not going to be close enough to the top of Group C to make him a good play there. He's a good play in a salary cap game because he's probably going to be, if not the cheapest driver, one of the 10 cheapest drivers in the game. And so that's going to free up some salary cap at the top. But in Group C, the concerns are different, and he's not going to finish close enough to any of those 4 guys we mentioned, or 3 guys and a gal that we mentioned, to make him a good play there.
All right. Any final thoughts before we go to the 400? It's 400 mile. Is it 400 miles or 400 laps this weekend, or 500 laps, or what is it?
Laps and 400.
Yeah.
This was the capital city 400 back in the day, and
that's right.
We're getting a little far from when they reconfigured this track, but I guess kind of the last thought is, and I'm not sure that anybody was even under the old configuration, but as they changed the tracks, the record books reset. This is one of those times when it really reset because the half-mile track was a lot different than the 3/4 mile track. So don't even think about any records from back then. Don't let that impact your decision making whatsoever, whether it be how many cautions they had or how many leaders they had, and only think about what's happened since this track's become a 3/4 mile track, and really only think about what's happened in the last 5 years, given the state of the car changes.
All right, he's Dan Beaver. Again, you read his fantasy analysis at yahoosports.com and rotoworld.com. Also, follow him on Twitter at FantasyRace. If you aren't already doing that, you should be. That content's also great during race weekend. You can follow me on Twitter at onpitrow, and watch us again next week when we come back. We'll talk about the first race of the chase, which will be at Chicagoland Speedway, and that'll be another interesting show. We'll kind of recap what happened here this week and see how it affects things going into those last 10 races of the season, which going to be a lot of people eliminated, and I would think that's got to affect somewhat what you pick going forward. So
Well,
All
and
right.
so most importantly, the drivers that are gambling this week will not be gambling next week.
That's right. That's right. Okay, he's Dan Beaver. I'm Charlie Turner. We'll see you again next week on Dan Beaver's NASCAR Fantasy Pit Stop next week for Chicago. Thanks, folks.